So it's about these three notions, Śūnyatā, Fanā, and Kenosis, that you might have heard of. And I will explain first what they mean. So they all mean emptiness. Emptiness is a notion, important notion in many religions, in philosophy. And there have been some studies on Kenosis, which is the Christian idea of emptying, compared with Śūnyatā. I think there is really no study on Fanā and Kenosis at all, so that would be the first one. Comparing all three is a little bit risky, because of course they come from different traditions, but still I try to do that. So 3 times emptiness. I should perhaps first explain why that would be useful. Why would anybody be interested in emptiness? Emptiness is a negative term, but it's important in philosophy, in religion, to empty oneself. One could say that people today, they're all so empty. They have no values, they have no convictions, no religion, no beliefs. They should be filled with something. But that is the wrong way of seeing it. The problem is actually not that they are empty, it's that they are too full. They are full of so many things. And that can be anything. That can also concern religion. I mean, a religious fanatic, his problem is not that he is empty. The problem is rather that he is too full of something. So this problem with filling and emptying is very current in religion. So I compare that. So first of all, there is Śūnyatā. You might all have heard the word. It's Hindu and also it's Buddhist, but it's also Hindu. Has been very much developed in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. So there's Nagarjuna talks a lot about that in context of Mahayana. He's the co-founder of Mahayana Buddhism. It went very much into Japanese philosophy as the emptiness, the ku, which I have here. So that would be the emptiness in Buddhism, and then it is often confounded with nothingness. So one could of course talk for hours about that. It's just define emptiness and nothingness. Does that mean the same thing? I would say yes. Normally in Buddhism one talks about emptiness, but then Zen Buddhism has had a lot of Taoist influence, and in Taoism nothingness is important, so they talk about nothingness. So the Japanese, you have heard of the mu, maybe in Chinese is wu, like in a wu way. So all this is Śūnyatā. So then there is Kenosis. In Christianity, it is the emptying of Christ. It appears in the Bible passage from the Philippians, and it's almost the only time that it appears in the Bible. So that Jesus emptied himself, and because Jesus is God, it means there's an emptying of God, because he abased himself to become a human. Based himself to the level of humanity. So Kenosis is the self-emptying or the self-renunciation of Christ, giving up his divine nature, though only temporarily. And through this act of self-sacrifice, God's act of self-sacrifice, he introduces first this very exceptional component into the monotheistic system that God can be incarnated by the person of Jesus Christ. And God gives up his omnipotence, omniscience, becomes a human being, but it happens through emptying. So the Canaan, the word Canaan, appears only 5 times in the New Testament. And it's a little bit like Fanā. There is so much writing about Fanā, but it appears very rarely in the Quran. So I copied this. Is from the Philippians. That is what is a starting point of all that. It is not that central in Christian theology. It was developed in the 19th century. Suddenly there is a real theology of Kenosis. Before was not that important. But it was picked up by Buddhists in the 80s, and there was 15 years of discussion where the Japanese philosophers were very fascinated by this idea of kenosis in Christianity, and there are books over books. I was working on that before. This exchange, the comparison of kenosis and Śūnyatā, now I wanted to associate this Muslim notion, this Islamic notion of Fanā to it, in order to do something new. So then there is Fanā, and I also put this quotation from the Quran. All things in creation suffer annihilation. There remains in its majesty and bounty. So Fanā is here rendered as annihilation in this translation. It's from Abdul Hamid, Oxford University Press. And the face of the Lord remains is the Yapkas, which is related to Baka, which I will talk about later. So there is always in Islamic theology this sequence of Fanā and Baka that means emptying and filling. And you can see that this is also interesting for other religions. What we have in the Quran, it's very surprising that Sufis especially attach so much importance to it, because it doesn't seem logical. There is really not much in it, but it has attracted the attention of the Sufis, and then also of many Japanese philosophers and Western philosophers from the beginning, because they saw here something Eastern, something from parallel with Eastern philosophy. Somebody compared it with Nirvana, with Fanā compared with Nirvana. I don't really agree there. Others talked about Samadhi, is a Buddhist, Hinduist notion. And there is really then a similarity with the Wahdat al-Haq, which is related to Fanā, and one really thinks that there seems to be a parallel with this annihilation of the self, of one's selfish ego. So there is certainly something. I could also mention the Tzimtzum, the Jewish Tzimtzum, which I don't deal with here, but it's interesting. There's a similar idea that God needs to retract himself, because when God created the world, there was no space, because he was everywhere. There was God everywhere, so he cannot create anything. So first he has to retract himself temporarily, and then he can create the world. So there is something similar here. It's a Kabbalistic notion, and it's quite recent. It's from the 19th century. It's not something traditional. Of course, you can imagine that it has been very much attacked. So there are some similarities, and I'm not saying that they are that they are necessary. They could be coincidental. There are similarities between what I call dharmic philosophies, that is Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism. Everywhere where you have the Dharma, and monotheistic philosophies, and it seemed to me that Sufism is a kind of linking element between monotheistic philosophies and Dharmic philosophies, and that's what I want to show. I could talk about the historical background, but we don't have enough time, and it's not my field anyway. I'm not a historian of philosophy, but one can, of course, ask oneself, where does it come from? There are different possibilities. Well, it could be all coincidence, and I believe somehow that it is. It could be that there is a lot of has been communication, and that is also true. There has been in the Middle East, in Central Asia, there have always contacts between India and the Greeks and the Egyptians already. So of course Islam was impregnated by that, without saying that they would have taken everything from it. Of course they did their own thing. There is a link between Sufism and Neoplatonism. Many people have been working on that. And Aristotle is dominant in Muslim philosophy. So there would be lots of things to say about historical connections. Certainly they existed. There was the Silk Road. They were going back and forth between Baghdad and Central Asia. And certainly they were also transporting certain ideas, certain concepts back and forth. So there are similarities. Why there are similarities, that is a different question. That I will not decide that. I'm just interested. I do comparative philosophy. I'm just comparing. Why? Because I think that by comparing something with something else, one understands better, both better. One sees differences, one thinks about them. And it helps us finally to understand the one through the other. But I'm not saying that they are necessarily that they copy each other. And I'm not into perennialism. You have heard maybe of perennialism. These are people who think that underneath all philosophical traditions, there must be one that is so fundamental that we have to find it. Now, one is very tempted to do that here. Emptiness, yes, emptiness. Maybe that is at the root of all philosophies, and we have to scrape away all the cultural particularities, and then we will find the philosophy. Now, I believe that this is nonsense. It doesn't work like that. It is very likely that a topic like emptiness that came to the mind of many people all over the world in different traditions, and they formulated that in their way, but it doesn't mean that everything comes from one common root. So I have that problem with perennialism, which exists since the 15th century, and many people adhere to it. So I compare, I have to point that out, I do not compare religions. I do not do comparative religion. I do comparative philosophy because I think it's impossible to compare religions. I mean, how do you want to do that? How do you want to compare Islam with Christianity? What is Islam? There are so many different Islams, you can't do that. What is Buddhism? It's impossible. I pick certain philosophers and certain concepts that I find interesting, that I find important. I choose them. And I compare these ideas. I compare different concepts. Of course, it's true that all concepts are inscribed in a certain background. But in the end, you compare concepts. You don't compare backgrounds. So I have here the timeline. You can see the names of people, but maybe you have heard of them. So it's a Zen master, is a Roshi, and then there's the Murshid. That is something similar, actually. So it's about these masters in religion. Most of them, Dharmic side, are Chinese and Japanese Zen masters. I'm interested in. Of course, there is Nagarjuna, that is old, and he's Indian. But then there are other streams, there are other people, there's Yunmen, Wenyan, Yoshu, there's Huineng, probably the founder of Zen Buddhism. So all these people, they lived in the 8th to 9th century, and that, I don't know if it's a coincidence, but it really matches all these Sufis who also lived in the 8th and 9th century. So there is Bastami, Muhasibi, Kharas, Junaid, Halash, Hujbiri, and Al-Shibli. I like Al-Shibli very much. That is called the period of classic Sufism. One can add some other people. There's Kukai, who founded the Shingon sect. He was so that is a little bit, 100 years later. He will be the contemporary of Al-Kindi, just to put some parallels to show, to draw a map of the history. And then you have later people like Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, Rumi, Kushairi, that belongs to a later period of classic Sufism, that is 13th, 16th century. In Japan, that will bring us to the Kamakura era, the war period, where many religious teachers came to the fore. There was Dogen in 1200. And then there is the Japanese, the Shinran school, Pure Land school. There's also Ikkyu, that is a bit later, 15th century, but Ikkyu is also eccentric. These eccentric people that somehow matches with the Sufis, with somebody like Al-Shibli, for example. So there on the Christian side, there are some mystics. So I decided not to talk too much about Christianity because it was getting just too long. So I took this out a little bit. So then there is the reception. I work with modern philosophers. It's something called the Kyoto School, who have prepared these thoughts somehow. And I said there is this discussion of Śūnyatā and Fanā, Śūnyatā and Kenosis, that has been done by the Kyoto School, but also by other people. And then, of course, there is Izutsu, Toshihiko Izutsu, but he wrote on Taoism, Sufism and Taoism. And he is not from the Kyoto School, but still very, very similar. So, of course, that is also one of the starting points of all this. So, apart from that, it's Zen schools, Rinzai school. That's what the Scottish school was doing. On the Christian side, there was a very strong response to the Zen Buddhist philosophy, apart from this Śūnyatā Kenosis discussion. There has always been a very strong discussion. There is nothing like something like the Kyoto school, that means a modern school of Sufism, that doesn't exist. So necessarily there it becomes more eclectic. One picks just some people that one thinks they are interesting. So I compare concepts. I don't compare entire religion. Sometimes people say, what you are doing is very broad. No, it's not. It's very narrow. Because that's the only way it can work. And narrow it down to certain ideas. And because you wouldn't say that somebody who compares Swami Vivekananda with John Dewey, that he is comparing Christianity with Hinduism. It doesn't make sense. You compare philosophers, and you are aware that they come from certain backgrounds, but that is all. The emptiness and fullness, that is an important topic in philosophy, in religion. We have Kenoma and Pleroma in Christianity, and the Sufi tradition works with Fanā and Baka. You empty, and then you have to fill it with something. Now, the Hindu or the Buddhist tradition does not really have that. One could think that they have it. They talk about emptiness, Śūnyatā. There is the word Purnata, but it's not very important because their idea is actually that when you really empty something, you have also emptied it of all distinctions between emptiness and fullness. So at the moment you have emptiness, it no longer makes sense to talk about fullness, because if your emptiness exists only in contrast with fullness, well, then that means that there is still fullness. You want to get rid of the fullness, so you talk of the emptiness, and this is why I prefer the word nothingness, and Zen Buddhism has always preferred that. It means there's emptiness, but it's so empty that there's not even emptiness. And then you cannot even talk about fullness. So when they talk about purnata, it is not the fullness, it is actually a fullness that also no longer distinguishes between emptiness and fullness. So in the end, it is the same thing as Śūnyatā. So that thought, which is so important, I thought that I can find something like that in Sufism. The Japanese found it in Kenosis, and of course many people were against it. Many people said, no, you can't do that, no, there is emptiness, and then it will be filled. Exactly like the Fanā baka, you empty yourself and then you fill yourself with God, and then you have fullness. That is very commonsensical, and most of the time it has been seen like that. But I wanted to tickle out something that is more like this Śūnyatā problem, and I think I found something. Yeah? So because if baka, it also is translated as abiding, then it means that one is still sticking to something, and that cannot really be the purpose of Fanā. We have to mention the notion of tahit, because this unity, it is linked to Fanā. When you enter yourself, you can see you have unity. You have unity with God, and you also believe in Wahid, in God as something Unitarian, is very important, and it's brought about by Fanā. In Judaism, there is the same idea, and it's actually linked to the Tzimtzum. So Buddhism has that too. When there is the no mind, then we can perceive the world as oneness, but we really have to empty ourselves, and then reality appears in a different way, as an alternate reality. So I think it's similar to what they call hakika or al-haq, and I think nobody would contest that. But then again, it has to be determined by emptiness, because the problem is always in all these discourses, if I reify emptiness, then it becomes another fullness. The problem of pantheism is exactly that one sees God as something as a fullness, and it becomes a fetish. What Hinduism, Buddhism says with Śūnyatā is that there is not only the individual that loses itself, that empties itself, but the thing that comes into the individual must also be empty. So in other words, the divine unity itself must be empty, because if there is still some fullness in it, it is not a unity. It can only be unified when it's completely empty. It leads us to the statement that God needs to be empty. The modern Japanese philosophers, they use the word God all the time for emptiness, for Śūnyatā. They have no problem with that. The nothingness, they will translate it as God sometimes. But then we have God as emptiness. Now that is difficult to push through in Islam. This deconstruction, it has worked quite well in Christianity, because there we have Jesus who empties himself, God who empties himself becomes Jesus. We really have an emptying of God. Now, how could we do that in Islam? It's a notion of Fanā. It's Bastami who has first worked on it. They didn't invent it, but they worked on it theoretically, elaborating the theory. He's famous saying Subhani, so instead of Subhan Allah, glory to me. Now, how can he speak of himself? So there, at that point, there was a schism in Sufism. There are those who are intoxicated and those who are sober. So a generation later, there was Al-Kharas. He formulated this idea of Fanā and Baka. And later that was then further developed by his student, by Junaid, who is a little bit better known. And there's a lot of Fanā and Baka by him. Then we have Halash. You might know Halash because of the poetry. People make music. So he said, "Ana al-Haq." So So that was completely intoxicated. He was condemned because of that. And not immediately. He also did some things, some good things. He restored life to the crown prince's favorite parrot. So he gets some credit for that. Well, he's so, and then there's one of his admirers is Al-Shibli, who is completely eccentric, provocative. And so there is a triangular relationship between these people, but there's always this fight between the intoxicated people and the sober people. So they are all people from the earlier period. It's often called the golden age, the charismatic age of Sufism. So Junaid has this theory of Fanā that is followed by Baka as the subsistence. First, there is the passing away, then there is the subsistence, but then in later Sufis like Ghazali or also Muhyi al-Din or Ibn Arabi, or also Rumi, they formulated in a slightly different way. And that comes a bit closer to Sufism, to Zen Buddhism, I find. So the question is really, can this emptying, the emptying of the self, does it imply that if God can enter the individual, that God has to be also not substantial? There is a fundamental problem. Fanā is presented as the emptying of the human self, of the nafs, when he faces God, and then there is the obliteration of the self, and God, through this mystical experience, God enters the empty space. In Buddhism, similar, when it talks about nirvana, nirvana means blowing out three things, greed, aversion, and ignorance. I think the ignorance is the most difficult thing to blow out. The greed, the aversion, maybe we can manage. Blow out ignorance, well, that's a bigger project. So there's also this idea of blowing out everything and then being dissolved, but there are differences. You see already that the reality that Buddhism then wants to describe is a purely relational, relative reality of impermanence, something non-substantial. So that is already different from the Hakika, which talks more in terms of authenticity and coherence. In Christianity, it's easier. We can obtain a concept of a human God first, and then even of a dying God. But Fanā, does it really address something like emptiness that comes from the side of God? As I said, Ibn Arabi, he uses the term ahad, which is the absolute one. it sounds, well, Isuzu thinks it has an equivalent in Wahid, in Taoism, so it's not Buddhism, but he talks about Taoism, the one that is used in Taoism, again, as the unity of many. I'm not entirely sure. It seems to me rather that when Taoism and also Islam, they're looking for the one, for the Tawhid, for oneness. To me, it seems that Buddhism is not looking for oneness, but for zeroness. That there is really nothing, so it changes everything. There is somebody, Knish, you might have read him, some people who work on this. He mentioned somebody, Harawi from Herat, is a representative of Hanbali Islam. He criticizes the traditional Sufi stations. He says they are tainted by duality, as well as by the mystics' self-centered impulses. So you see that somehow the unity is not attained because there is still a separation of the person from God. And this is exactly what Buddhism wants to avoid. If God is nothingness, then God can really come into the person, and dualism is overcome. We talk about the individual. What happens to the individual? Is the individual entirely submerged? Does it subsist? Is it completely extinct? Now you see there's a problem if there is no self. In what can God go? In what can God install itself if the self is entirely extinct? One needs another way of thinking here. One needs to overcome this dualism, and some Sufis have tried that. I find Al-Shibli quite funny. He has something Zen Buddhist. You see, Al-Shibli, he wanted to be alone with God. But he wanted to be completely alone with God. That means there should not even be Al-Shibli. He wanted to be completely alone, because if there is Al-Shibli, then he's not alone, then he is with himself. You see what he is trying to do. He wants to really overcome this dualism through maybe this, it sounds like a joke, because otherwise you reify the emptiness and you just create another fullness that this time you think this must be the real fullness because I have emptied myself and filled with God. So to avoid that, we should just overcome this logic of filling and emptying, and I think that was his idea. We can say it in another way. It would be a mistake, and the Western thinkers do this. It would be a mistake to think that emptiness is a psychological state. Emptiness is not a feeling. It is just nothing. But we think that there is now the emptiness, and now comes the feeling, and now comes the feeling of emptiness that will be filled with ourself. But it is not, that is also a dualistic separation. It's Cartesian, we have body and mind, so we think the body is a thing, where the mind is separate, it must be another thing. But the mind is not the thing. So Sufism and Zen Buddhism especially, they try to avoid that, to see the spirit as something objective. It's an ineffable spirit, and it's not even a psychological state. I want to tell a story, a comparison that I found. It takes me, the book takes a lot of pages to get there, but I will tell you this. You know this story from Taoism. Now this is Taoism, but because Isutsu talks so much about Sufism and Taoism, I think it's justified to bring this up. You know the story of the butterfly. Everybody knows the Zhangzi and the butterfly, and that he thought he's a butterfly. So there is a story that I find very similar by Bastami, where he describes the process of Fanā and the loss of his identity by becoming a bird. So not a butterfly, but a bird. So people interpret it as the loss of identity and restoration of identity. But the question is, after everything that I have said now, should we really see it like that? So he describes this mystical experience, mystical state, where he transforms into a bird. He describes the Fanā, the annihilation, and then the subsequent filling with Baka, which he attributes to the divine, to God's subjectivity, and then also the awareness of God, so the Tahit. And it appears in the Book of Flashes by Al-Sarash, where he Bastami hasn't written it, but where he describes that. Where Bastami is no longer Bastami because Bastami has ceased to be. So Fanā, annihilation, and now he exists only through the inflowing attributes of God. And one can infer from that is this kind of immanence and transcendence that produces this spiritual transformation. I can read you this passage. As soon as I arrived at his oneness, I became a bird, whose body was unity and whose wings were of everlastingness. So I continued to fly through the ether of howness, kaifia, for 10 years until I came to the air of something like 1,000,000 times. It did not cease flying until I came to the field of pre-eternity, and I saw there the tree of unity. Then I looked and I knew that it was all a cheat, a khuda, one translates it as cheat.
فنا فنا فنائي وفي فنائي وجدت أنت
He was famous for his ecstatic utterances, and it's an account of a mirage. The letter in the Islamic tradition, it's normally associated to the Prophet. So he is flying. In the Jewish tradition too, this flying is kind of metaphoric for ecstasy, for an ecstatic state of mind. People have concluded that this passage alludes to the indescribable, to the attainment of unity, the unlimited, depicting poetically the spiritual journey of unity, reaching unity. But does it really conclusively affirm that he has arrived at a clear identity? Because then he says, and I looked at it, and I knew that it was all a cheat. Now, what is the cheat here? Is it his own identity, or is it his identity as a bird? It could be both. There is no clear answer, and some people have found that. So the dream could also express a state of nothingness or emptiness in which the identity no longer matters. Where he actually arrived is as a state where he no longer cares whether he is a bird or not. So we have this, the same thought we have in the Taoist butterfly story. So you see, it's the flying is always typical for this mystical experience, because flying means, well, it means already taking a risk. It means going into incertitude when you fly, and also you open yourself up to a completely new experience. So the metaphor of flying is important. So we have it in Sufism, and we also have it in Taoism. It's a presumed certainty safety is abandoned. So the butterfly parable is in the Zhuangzi. It's the last chapter in this book called The Adjustment of Controversies, and he also deals with the topic of transformation of his dream experience. So it goes in the translation. I will explain why I use this translation. So once Zhuangzi fell into a dream, and then there was a butterfly, a fluttering butterfly, self-content in accord with its intentions, acting happily within himself, with himself, and with wishes gladly fulfilled. Usually the famous translation is by Giles, which starts differently. It starts with the sentence, "I dreamt I was a butterfly." Now that sounds much clearer. Here the translator, my friend Hans-Georg Müller, he translated it as once Zhuangzi fell into a dream and then there was a butterfly. You see, there is no I, simply because in Chinese there is no I. He doesn't say I, he doesn't say who is who. He leaves that completely open, and that is important. It's a bit like a dream, like Paul Valéry has said that we should never say that I dreamt, because you didn't dream as I. We should just say there was dream, there was a dream. And somehow you experienced it, but you didn't dream it as an I. It's exactly that idea here, that the I is from the beginning deconstructed. So with relationship to Fanā and Baka, it is something like, it is not that there is emptiness and then there's a fullness, but Fanā and Baka exist a little bit like différence, like Derrida's différence, that the one exists only in comparison with the one and the other in the comparison with the other. So they both constantly determine each other, and that's the only reason why they exist. So the I is not there, and that is the whole purpose. So also in Zhuangzi, it is not clear whether he is dreaming that he is a butterfly, or whether it is the butterfly that is dreaming that he is Zhuangzi. So because there is no I, so Taoism undermines the identity. And I thought that there is the same thing expressed in this experience of non-identity. Okay, I stop here. Thank you very much.
God.